All right. Yeah. So I've been with the club for 42 years. Started out as an organizer in Wyoming, and slowly worked up. I was field director for a while, which is what Bob Bingaman is doing now, and then communications director and conservation director. And now they kick me upstairs, and I do special projects and agitate and ponder history. And one thing I did was I was chair of a legacy task force that looked into Sierra Club's history that sometimes was not so pretty. And so we were examining membership exclusion and racism and issues like that. So it got me fascinated to not only talk about the good, positive side of our history, but also so people could understand the other parts of our history. So that's what this is about. It's sort of a, I'm going to say, Howard Zinn history of the Sierra Club. It's not just going to be rosy stuff, but I want to explain some of the other things, and because you'll hear them in your tenure at the Sierra Club about how John Muir was a racist, or we had some eugenicists who were early founders of the Sierra Club, or we were excluding blacks, and so we'll get into some of those so you can understand the context, not to explain them away, but to understand what really went on and how hopefully we've evolved to a better place. So with that, let me shift over. Just there. Oops. There. Thank you. That's why I have Liz here. Okay, into this. So I think in order to understand the context of a old group like the Sierra Club, now 126 years old, you need to really also understand the overall context of the U.S. history that the Sierra Club grew up in. So there's lots of dark episodes in our history, everything from leading up to the Civil War, to the Chinese Exclusion Act, to internment of Japanese Americans, to a bunch of the stuff that's going on now around immigration and police violence and the rest. And so the Sierra Club and its leaders and its members grew up in that environment, and it's just important to try to keep that in mind as we look at the history. The other thing I'll just point out is that the Sierra Club is not today the organization that it was for the first 75 years of its life. That we started out as a California hiking club with just a couple hundred members, mainly in the Bay Area. And we didn't have chapters outside of California. And there was a conscious effort not to have chapters outside of California because they wanted it to be a club that was all people that knew each other. And as a matter of fact, you needed to have 2 sponsors of existing members in order to get into the Sierra Club, which thereby kept it small. And if it started out largely white and affluent, that was a sure way to make sure that it stayed white and affluent. I don't think that was the purpose of it, but that was nevertheless the effect and the impact and the outcome. I just put these symbols here so you can see the upper left is the first one. The Altirio Peto means ever higher, so I don't know if they were smoking dope in those days or that was just a good motto for go climb the mountains. But you can see the tree there looks more like a sprig of broccoli. And over time, we did evolve. Second row lower left, you can see at our centennial, 1892 to 1992, made it look like we died then, so that wasn't a particularly good logo either. And so we are where we are today. But here's this guy, John Muir. He was the first president of the Sierra Club. Sometimes I use the word founder, but I've been corrected on that because actually there were a group of people that all got together in a room to found the Sierra Club. But I want to talk a little bit about him pre-Sierra Club so that you can kind of understand where he came from, because it's an important part of our history, even though his founding the Sierra Club came fairly late in his life. So he was a Scottish immigrant, brought over as a young boy, moved to a farm in upper Wisconsin. There he was raised a strict Scotch Presbyterian life and hard toil on the farm. He actually rejected that. He grew up and memorized the Bible, among other things. But he wanted to be an inventor. And he ultimately invented all kinds of crazy machines. He invented a desk that would actually turn the pages of a book. He invented a bed that when the sun came and stretched a little piece of cat hair, it then turned around and flipped the bed and woke you up. So there were all kinds of things he did, and he won some contests at the Wisconsin State Fair for his inventions. He then went off to work in a carriage and buggy factory, again promoting his sort of engineering invention background. And in the course of it, he had an industrial accident, and a piece of iron filing flew up into his eye, and he got a sympathetic reaction, and both eyes went blind. And he thought that he was never going to see again, and he just wore bandages around his head for over a month. And ultimately, his sight came back in both eyes, and at that time, he declared that he no longer wanted to devote himself to the works of man, but instead he wanted to devote himself to protecting the works of nature and studying them. So he started off on a 1,000-mile walk to the Gulf. So he's in Indiana, and he walked all the way down to Florida. This is post-Civil War, so he's going through Reconstruction era in the South. And if you read some of his writings about the 1,000-mile walk to the South, there are some derogatory comments about the blacks that he meets there. And he calls them lazy, he calls them dirty. So, you know, it's, again, he's a product of his time, but he does have these, you know, racially insensitive remarks that he publishes in his writings at that time. These are some of the first black people he'd ever met, and in fact, they were quite destitute in the wake of the Civil War. But he also befriended some, and he stayed in their houses, and he was a tramp. I mean, he had no money. He was sleeping in graveyards, and sometimes black families would invite him into the house, and he was quite complimentary and thankful for that. So he was basically educating himself about racial relations post-Civil War. Gets down to Florida, contracts malaria. He was going to go on to South America and visit the Amazon, but instead he decides to go to California. And he's heard about this place called Yosemite. So Yosemite was established as the first public park in the country, not by the Sierra Club, not by John Muir, but by some people that petitioned Abraham Lincoln. And in the depths of the Civil War, 1864, they take time out from the Civil War in order to designate the first public park for the enjoyment of the people. Prior to that, all the federal lands were basically giveaway. You had the Homestead Act, the 1872 mining law, the Swampland Act, that basically said anything that had any minerals or farming potential or trees, we're just going to give it away. And it's the great barbecue out there. And this Yosemite land grant as a park is the first time that they've ever turned around and decided to dedicate public land for public purposes. It was actually challenged in the Supreme Court by somebody who wanted to develop Yosemite, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor and said, no, you know, a president and a Congress can actually do this and save land for protection purposes. So this is 1864, long before John Muir shows up in California, but he starts hearing about this magical place called Yosemite. So he takes a boat down to the Isthmus of Panama, walks across it, takes a steamship up to California, to San Francisco, gets off, and he says, you know, what's the way out of quickest way out of town? And they said, well, where do you want to go? And he said, any place that's wild. And at that time, they didn't have a Bay Bridge, so he got on a ferry, took it across to Oakland, and then he started walking to Yosemite. He walks across Pacheco Pass, across the Central Valley, up into the Sierra Nevada, where he meets Yosemite and just falls in love with the place. And he just can't believe how beautiful it is. Now, when he gets there, there are no Native Americans there. And the reason is that prior to that, all the 100+ years of colonialism, starting with the Spanish, have basically extirpated all of the Native Americans. So the Spanish come up and they drive them into missions, and in the course of that, they give them smallpox and they die off in great numbers, and then they round them up and put them in reservations. Ultimately, with the Spanish-American War, the U.S. takes over California. The first governor of California then starts a war on Native Americans. Again, pre-Sierra Club, pre-John Muir. And he basically enlists the battalion, and they hear that there's some hostile Indians living up in Yosemite. And so the battalion goes up there and drives them all out and runs them down to a reservation in the Central Valley, as well as killing half of them. So again, it's not conservationists that are doing this because they want to save Yosemite. This is basically white colonial government operating on behalf of settlers and ranchers and farmers that want the Native American land for themselves. But then after the Native Americans are driven out and word comes back about this beautiful valley that the Native Americans used to live in, that's when the move starts happening among citizens of California to petition Abe Lincoln to create this Yosemite National Park, which he ultimately does. So John Muir shows up on the scene 1868, 4 years after Yosemite is established as a park. And he wanders up to this place called Yosemite, falls in love with the place, and just starts taking odd jobs so he can stay up there. So at first he becomes a sheep herder, and then he runs a sawmill that is in Yosemite Valley floor. And ultimately he starts writing about it, and because he's climbing all the peaks and he just thinks it's ecstatic, and he meets this journalist, and the journalist basically says, hey, you know this place and I don't, you write very well, would you start writing some articles for me? And so this is a publication, it's called Harper's Weekly, Scribner's Monthly, these are all in the late 1880s. And so John Muir says, sure, and then together they hatch this plan to basically say, right now only Yosemite Valley floor and a couple giant trees are protected. We think we ought to protect all the land around it as one big national park. And so the two of them collaborate on this, and John Muir says, well, I'll write the articles if you turn around and go lobby the Congress, because you live back on the East Coast. And so they do, and within a year, they've managed to establish Yosemite as the second national park in the country. The first was Yellowstone, and Yosemite then became a national park as well. So they have this national park, and then this journalist he's working with says, we really need some kind of organization that's actually going to protect this park from future exploiters and abuse and potentially reducing the boundaries. He says, so why don't we set up some conservation group in order to do this? And so around a campfire, they hatch the idea of the Sierra Club. And they go back to the Bay Area where these fledgling universities of Stanford and Berkeley are, and there's people there that are trying to set up a hiking club. And so John Muir gets together with them and he says, hey, I want to do this conservation group, you want to do this hiking group, why don't we create something that we'll call the Sierra Club that can do both? It can explore, enjoy, and protect the mountains. And they think that's a cool idea. So in 1892, they finally established the Sierra Club. As they establish it, it's this small little group, primarily of white, affluent people. I mean, they're students at the university, there's professors, there's some lawyers, there's some women that are also outdoors people, and they all collaborate and form this thing called the Sierra Club. And at first it stays very small, and all it does is it basically goes out and hikes around the mountains, and they have a jolly good time and try to make sure that nobody's going to impinge on Yosemite and Sequoia Kings Canyon, which also was set aside as a national park. But then along comes this proposal to dam one of the valleys in Yosemite. It's called Hetch Hetchy, and that's what this picture is here. At the time, Hetch Hetchy was a twin valley to what Yosemite is today. It had the flat bottom, had the beautiful waterfalls, wild as can be, but it also was the perfect site for a dam as far as the city of San Francisco was concerned. And so there was a proposal to dam Hetch Hetchy. And that was really the first big conservation battle that the Sierra Club got into, to basically try to stop the dam. And we managed to stop it for 15 years, but ultimately after the earthquake in San Francisco, when the city burned down, they falsely claimed that the reason it burned down is because it didn't have enough water, and if they only had a reliable source of water, they could have saved the city. Well, heck, they live on San Francisco Bay. They had plenty of water. That was not the problem. But nevertheless, they did convince the Congress to dam it, and shortly thereafter, John Muir died. He died of pneumonia. Some people say he died of a broken heart. But in any case, that was the first big battle of the Sierra Club. And instead of just being primarily a hiking club, it suddenly became a conservation advocacy club. But again, still made up strictly of Californians, predominantly, if not exclusively white, and largely affluent. I mean, John Muir was a tramp, but he ultimately married a rich woman and moved to a Victorian house. And so he lived quite well after that. But, you know, it wasn't a broad, inclusive, diverse organization, and it basically stayed that way for decades thereafter. So you don't see much action by the Sierra Club. They're just in California. They're basically just protecting the parks that they've got. And then around World War II, one of the people that was young and grew up in the Sierra Club is this photographer who starts out by taking pictures of Yosemite with his Brownie Hawkeye camera, and over time he gets better and better, and he becomes a nationally and internationally renowned photographer named Ansel Adams. And Ansel is on the board of directors of the Sierra Club. He also is living in Yosemite Valley and running the Sierra Club's visitor center there. And he gets the idea that we basically want to protect a lot more parks all over the West. And so he starts taking pictures of these. And actually, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, during the Depression, as part of the Workers Project, turned around and contracted with Ansel Adams to go around the West and take pictures of beautiful places. And Ansel Adams did that. He then put them into a book, and then he would go back and lobby Franklin Delano Roosevelt to establish more national parks in the West. And so at that point, the Sierra Club starts branching out and acting on conservation efforts exclusively in the West, but to create more national parks, but still with a California membership base. And again, a membership base that is largely urban and largely white. And this happens throughout the 1950s. World War II comes. At the end of World War II, this returning veteran, this guy named David Brower, comes back, and he is the editor of the Sierra Club's magazine. And they decide to hire him to be the first executive director. So we did have one staff member, a woman named Virginia Ferguson, who kept index cards of the membership in a shoebox. But the first time we actually had a professional conservation staff of one was David Brower, and he joined the staff in the 1950s, right after World War II. And David Brower has big visions of where he wants to go with the Sierra Club. He doesn't want it to stay a California hiking club, although he is a great mountaineer himself. He did a number of first ascents all over the West. He did them in Yosemite, he did them in Mount Rainier, he did them down in Shiprock in New Mexico. Brower decides that he wants to take this organization national and open it up. So as I mentioned earlier, before, you had to have 2 sponsors in order to join the Sierra Club. And those sponsors had to be members of the Sierra Club that knew you. And as a result, it stayed very small and stayed very white. And Dave Brower said, that's not the way this ought to be. So he said, I'm going to sponsor anybody sight unseen. And furthermore, I'm going to move through the board of directors a bylaw to change it so you don't have to get sponsorships anymore. And he succeeded in both fronts. The other thing he did that really changed the dynamic is before, you had to have these 2 sponsors, and then you basically had to go in front of a membership committee and be interviewed about whether or not you would be good enough to be a member of the Sierra Club. And the membership committee down in the Angeles chapter in Los Angeles was basically screening people and deciding that they didn't want any blacks in the Sierra Club. And so they consciously, whenever a person of color would apply for the Sierra Club, they would reject them. And when word of that got up to San Francisco and to the board of directors and to Dave Brower, they turned around and laid down the law and said, no, you cannot do it. You have to let these people in. They dismissed the exclusionary membership committee. And they basically said the only reason you can exclude somebody from being a Sierra Club member is if they're under 14 years of age, as we don't think they're of an age when they could turn around and determine whether they actually wanted to be a member themselves. So anyway, that you will hear stories about the Sierra Club excluding people of color and others. And there is some truth to that, but it was never official policy. It wasn't like a whites-only organization. That was just how it ended up, largely because people were controlling it and controlling it very tightly and only inviting in the people that looked like them. And in Dave Brower's time, that then turned around and hopefully the floodgates were opened. And so during the same period, for the first time, they create a chapter outside of California. It's called the Atlantic chapter, and it includes everybody who wants to join the Sierra Club that lives east of the Mississippi. They have another chapter that is up in Washington State called the Cascade chapter. They had a Rocky Mountain chapter that was Colorado, Wyoming, Montana, the Dakotas, and Nebraska. And when I first joined the Sierra Club, that huge chapter with those 6 states still existed as one. So part of my job early on in the Sierra Club was every time we had 300 members in a state, I would then go establish a new chapter. And so now we have chapters in every state plus Puerto Rico. And in the case of California, we actually have about, I think, 14 chapters because it's more city-based than anything else. Anyway, Dave Brower is the one who really transformed all that. Brower also started big national campaigns again, like we'd had on Hetch Hetchy. So one was to pass the Wilderness Act in 1964. And so there's Dave Brower on the far right, looking down as President Kennedy is signing the Wilderness Act. Brower also ran a bunch of big campaigns to stop dams in national parks. At that time, the Sierra Club was still primarily exclusively involved in parks and wilderness and wildlife refuges and wildlife issues, but it wasn't involved in pollution issues. And, you know, people joined because they were hikers and they wanted to go protect the great outdoors. And that stayed pretty much the case until 1970, when Earth Day came around. And at that time, there were just a whole series of terrible environmental events that were occurring. There was a huge oil spill off Santa Barbara that made headlines. The Cuyahoga River in Ohio caught fire that made headlines. Lake Erie was declared dead because it had too much phosphate detergent in it, and the fish were going belly up there. And all those things led to this huge mass movement in 1970. The Sierra Club organized around that. They hired a student organizer, the first, we didn't have a Sierra Student Coalition, but the first student organizer we ever had was turning people in mass movement out. We had millions of people in the streets in 1970. So at that time, the Sierra Club is growing so that we have a presence in every state, though not necessarily a chapter in every state. And we've got a portfolio that's both land wildlife protection and pollution and the urban environment protection. Also around that time, we had the biggest campaign in our history. This was the Alaska Lands Act. It ultimately was signed in 1980 by President Carter, but throughout the 1970s, and this was the first big battle I had, it was a fight over the future of Alaska. Alaska lands had never really been set aside for various purposes, and we had a provision in a bill that basically allowed the public to designate up to 100 million acres of new parks, wilderness, wild and scenic rivers, and monuments. And so with this one act of the Alaska Lands Act, we managed to double the size of the park system, double the size of the wildlife refuge system, double the size of the wild and scenic river system in one fell swoop and signature of the pen. The other thing that was very interesting about the Alaska Wilderness Act is it's the first one that ever incorporated environmental justice into it. And so rather than say, these are exclusive and no people can exist in there, they recognized subsistence rights and the indigenous people and basically allowed them to continue that subsistence existence within the new parks and preserves that were being established. Move forward, and welcome to Katrina time, Louisiana. We have a huge convention of the Sierra Club and bring delegates from all the chapters together. And we basically give them all credentials and say, tell us what the agenda ought to look like for the future of the Sierra Club. And it being just after An Inconvenient Truth came out, where the keynote speaker is Al Gore, and Katrina has just inundated the Gulf Coast, and particularly New Orleans, the Sierra Club decides that it's time to address climate change in a much, much bigger way than we've ever done. Prior to that, we had a minor climate change program around automobile fuel efficiency, but we decided that we really wanted to go tackle the coal industry, tackle all the dirty fuels, and make climate our Uber campaign because it was threatening everything. It was threatening the wildlife, it was threatening the parks, it was threatening the people, it was threatening global existence. And as a result, it was going to be a big overarching campaign and one they were going to focus on. So we wouldn't drop our work on pollution or drop our work on parks and wilderness areas, but we were going to step up and add this new leg and really emphasize it and try to encourage everybody to embrace it. And that wasn't an easy thing for the Sierra Club to turn around and do, because a lot of these people had joined the Sierra Club because they wanted to be hikers and they wanted to work on parks and wilderness, and to suddenly be talking about shutting down coal-fired power plants and stopping dirty fuels and pipelines, it was not quite the Sierra Club they thought they'd signed up for. But at the same time, a whole new generation of people started coming in that said, I'm not your old conservationist. I don't really care so much about all those land protection issues. I'm a climate activist, and I want the Sierra Club to be my home. And so there was this merger and merriment that basically ended up doubling the size of the Sierra Club. But it wasn't just because we were taking on climate change. It was also because we were adopting a whole bunch of new, far more aggressive and inclusive tools and tactics and campaigns, and trying to build a progressive movement rather than an exclusive talk to yourselves tight environmental land protection movement. Which brings me to equity. Sierra Club started early, but not early enough, with having an environmental justice program. So back in the 1980s, while I was conservation director, we hired our first environmental justice organizers. We asked that we would only do it where we were invited into communities, and people like Daryl Malik Wiley, that you know well there in Louisiana, and others joined, and we had a network of environmental justice organizers. We adopted our first environmental justice principles. About that same time, there was a People of Color Summit that took place. And the People of Color Summit basically called out the national conservation groups and basically said, you guys are controlling everything. You've got all the money, you've got the agenda, you're determining how all these projects turn out. And in the process of doing that, you're basically shifting the pollution to the fence line communities. We don't have a voice in this. We don't want you speaking for us. We want to speak for ourselves. And we want to be part of and leading the environmental movement rather than taking orders from you guys. And so they sent something out to all of the heads of all the major grassroots conservation groups. So, well, and also all the others. So NRDC, Environmental Defense Fund, Audubon Wildlife Federation, Sierra Club, they were basically all called out and said, hey, you guys are operating in a way that is unjust. It's leading to environmental racism, and something different needs to be done about this. And we've got a plan, and that's where the Jimenez principles came out as well. And the Sierra Club at first was in denial and said, oh, no, that's not us. And then the more we looked at it, the more we realized that, in fact, we were the problem. And we weren't doing what we needed to do, and we needed to do far more. So, after that, we basically adopted this equity, justice, inclusion format. We developed our multi-year plan. We set up a whole equity department. So we still have our environmental justice program, but there's also a big internal focus on trying to transform the Sierra Club so that our own staff, our own members are getting the fact of why we are involved in justice issues, why we're standing for immigrants, why we're standing for gender equity. And then at the same time, trying to build this broad coalition and rebuild some of the trust. We've also, in the process, had to turn around and change a bunch of our policies. So originally, the Sierra Club was supporting limits on immigration, not in terms of only let white people in, but we were concerned with population numbers, and so we said there's only a certain number of people that can come in. We don't care if they come from Mexico or Northern Europe, but there's only a certain number that ought to come in because we don't want to have too many people in the United States. It was a very America First approach to population. We ultimately abandoned that, renounced it, and basically said, no, we aren't going to do that. We're going to support DAPA and DACA and immigrant rights, and we're going to work for women's empowerment and economic development so that people can allow themselves to stay in their home countries because they choose to do so by choice and because they have opportunity and they have safety and they have access to family planning and can determine their own futures. And when they have all that, they're less likely to form a caravan and feel like they've got to flood the US borders. But that's the approach rather than building fences. So we're against the border wall, and instead we support women's empowerment and that kind of approach to trying to protect immigrants and defend people's equity and justice all around the world. And that's kind of the end of the talk I have here. I'm glad to answer any questions. I also have a bunch of papers that we've prepared if people want to dig deep into our history on population or immigration or exclusionary membership or any of those things. But why don't we just go back if people have some questions, comments? I'm all yours.
Thanks, Bruce. That was great to see that. Really appreciated the presentation. Folks, remember to go off of mute before you put out a question or a comment, please.
I have a question. This is Minda. Thank you so much for this really great presentation. It was, I feel like I knew some of it, but I didn't know all of it, so it was really great. One question that I get a lot, so I'm curious about your response to it, because I have my own response, is this issue around mission creep. And so kind of expanding to talk about immigration, expanding to talk about gender equity, you know, are we, or in the case of the Bay chapter, we talk a lot about housing and affordable housing and stuff like that, and trying to connect it back to environmental issues. How do you sort of address when people are sort of either concerned or angry or what have you about Sierra Club having perceiving this as mission creep?
Well, we have always been a big tent organization where we empower people to work on any issue that fits broadly within Sierra Club policy and positions. So we don't turn around and say, we have decided that we aren't going to work on toxics, even though it's not a national priority. But if there's people that want to work on toxics and our policy says, you know, we want to clean up toxics and not have them ruining our lives, then people can go do it. Now, the question comes in when we start getting involved into social issues. So that if we're suddenly involved in things that people don't regard as environmental, so that if you're dealing with gender equity, you're dealing with immigration, you're dealing with voting rights, you know, are those really Sierra Club issues or is that mission creep? And the board of directors and the senior staff and many of the chapter leaders, though not all, you know, have said, no, those are legitimate issues to get involved in. That voting rights basically leads to better environmental policies. The gender equity basically leads to better environmental policies and protecting all humans. That, you know, human rights are environmental rights. That, you know, we can't be a fair and just country if we're treating our people badly. If we're, you know, we also want to establish strong relationships and build a big tent movement. And you can't do that by just saying, well, you help us on protecting polar bears in the Arctic, but when it comes time to worry about Black Lives Matter and police brutality, I'm sorry, we can't be out there in the streets with you because that's mission creep. Well, you know, they can turn around then and say, well, why should I ever work on climate change? Because that's mission creep for us. And mission creep rhetoric leads to isolated movement to the point that you don't have the power you need. And so I think people that understand power dynamics understand the importance of helping each other and lifting all boats at the same time and building a movement that can, you know, because, you know, Donald Trump is bad for the environment, he's bad for human rights, he's bad for civil rights, he's bad for energy justice, you know, you name it. It's all one set of people and it's all one movement, and we need to be supporting each other. So some people get that and some people don't. And, you know, if people want to stay in their silo, fine, but the Sierra Club doesn't want to stay there.
Thank you. Well, shucks, I have another question if nobody else does. I would love to know what your vision is in terms of, it's the Sierra Club's such an extraordinary organization because it has this national programming and also has chapters. And I'm really interested to hear what your vision is and how these things fit together, particularly like where chapters sit and where their strength is, and how they fit into sort of the national vision.
Well, the Sierra Club would not be the organization it is, nor have the power that it has if we didn't have chapters. So, I mean, I think we're the envy of the rest of the environmental movement because, NRDC, EDF, whatever, they don't have any grassroots. So, they can be good lawyers, they can be good lobbyists back in Washington, D.C. or in Sacramento, but at the end of the day, they can't really reach out and engage in local, state, regional, and national politics. I mean, they always have to turn to the Sierra Club and say, hey, can you mobilize your people in North Dakota or, wherever it is, because, we don't have any power, we don't have any strength, and we don't have any ability there. But the ability to mobilize people in North Dakota isn't just to mobilize them on some national issues. Why do people join the Sierra Club in North Dakota? Because they want to protect North Dakota. Or the same's true in Oakland or Louisiana or Maine. And so if you don't help people with their own local backyard issues, whether it's toxics or climate change or land protection or wildlife protection or whatever it is, then they aren't going to turn around and help you. And furthermore, the way to build a big movement in a place like Puerto Rico or Maine is to basically be relevant to the issues in that state. And so it's important for the national organization to build space for, provide resources for, and partner with the chapter by giving them the tools and the ability to be effective advocates on their state and local issues, so that in fact that network of people is there when we may ultimately need to tap them in order to defend the Clean Power Plan or get better methane rules or whatever it is that we're trying to get at the time. The other thing is the reason I've stayed with Sierra Club so long is because it has this ability to both operate locally and operate nationally. You may want to protect the North Woods of Maine, but at some point you need a national network to do that because it can't just happen within Maine because there are some national issues if you're trying to create a national monument or expand it or give it more power or deal with the Caribou National Forest up there. So you've got to basically have a national network too. And, it's why I was attracted to the Sierra Club as opposed to any other group, because it basically magnified my voice when I was living in Wyoming, so that even though I didn't have great politics in Wyoming, I could appeal to other people that cared about Wyoming and could put pressure on to basically hold the forces of development at bay. So I just think the more we can support each other with tools, with partnerships, with trainings, with sharing lists, sharing skills, the better. I couldn't think of a better thing for the Sierra Club than to have, all whatever it is, 63, 65 chapters at their peak with full capacity. And that's one of the things that's missing. So as we're looking at developing on the next big capital campaign to try to raise millions of additional dollars for the Sierra Club and millions of new members and supporters, one of the appeals we want to do is to try to say we need to get more resources so that our chapters are the most robust, effective in all the different locations, and we don't have any chapters that are weak sisters that can't really do the job in their territory because they don't have enough members, they don't have enough resources, they don't have enough staff. So that's the vision that we have, is to try to have all chapters at full potential capacity, and that way the Sierra Club will actually be at full potential capacity.
That's very helpful to know, and I'm going to throw in one more follow-up question, and then I will let somebody else ask a question. I'd love to, you get sort of you get to see the whole country. I only get to see the Bay Area and in my own chapter, and I realize my chapter is every chapter is really unique in its own special way. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you see as probably one of the bigger challenges to chapters across the country. and like you're talking about how we can make them more robust. Like what are some common issues that you feel like you see kind of from the top?
Well, I think dealing with our own internal reluctance to embrace equity, justice, and inclusion is the biggest problem facing the Sierra Club. The Sierra Club of the future has to be far more diverse, far more inclusive, with a real justice focus on everything we do so that we're fully embracing and living the Jemez principles. And while we've trained the staff in that, and we've trained the board of directors in that, and a smattering of council delegates and a couple chapters have had some equity training, until this really permeates the Sierra Club so that we aren't consciously or unconsciously being exclusionary. That's when it's going to be an inviting place, and that's when we can actually grow to our full potential, where we can double, triple, quadruple the size of our membership, that we'll just have so much more political power. I mean, here in California, where you come from and I come from, Mindy, it's already a minority white state. And how do you remain a white organization and be relevant and be powerful in a minority white state? And so it's really important that we fully embrace this, and that we're seeking leaders and spokespeople that have that kind of broad vision, but also fully represent America. That our meetings, where are we holding them? Are we holding them in white neighborhoods that are uncomfortable for other people to come? Is the language that we're using in our magazines or our website incomprehensible because we only have things in English? Are we, through various ways that we're recruiting people or nominating leaders or whatever, basically replicating ourselves and staying white and staying in power? How do we turn around and try to invite in a whole new set of leaders? And then also looking at addressing some of the issues that are more important to those communities. So even though we've traditionally worked on a bunch of stuff, which may be the primary concern of the older white guard membership, there may be a whole bunch of new environmental issues that the committee leaders and the chapter XCOM leaders are not embracing because they aren't the traditional agenda, and as a result, we're not seen as relevant, so that Communities for a Better Environment or some other group that has more of an environmental justice focus ends up being the place where people go if they want to see action on environmental justice. And I'd like the Sierra Club to be a place where we fully embrace environmental justice and people want to come to us because they know that's where they can get things done, where they'll be welcome, where they'll be invited to be leaders, and where they'll gain power and ultimately take over the Sierra Club. And I just don't think a lot of chapter leaders get that, and they want to hold on to power and they want to hold on to leadership, and they just keep running for election over and over again. And we're starting to look like the Congress, and we don't want to look like the Congress.
Thank you. That was very helpful.
Hey, Bruce. Hi. Can you hear me? This is John Ullman.
Hey, how there?
Hey, how's it going?
So are you a chapter director now?
Yes.
Where are you?
Los Padres chapter.
Whoa, welcome. Okay. You
Ventura
got
County.
the job. I knew you were trying. Okay, wonderful.
Yeah, so I've been here since July. And, I know that a lot of the ways that Sierra Club attracts members is through, I guess, online marketing methods. And it seems to me that's where a definite push has to be to attract members of color. What is being done on that end? Because you talk about some of the other efforts, group meetings, leadership, but at the retail end, when people are paying the $15 to become a member, what is being done to recruit people of color that way?
Yeah, well, you are correct, and we are recognizing that. We have a special program that is a collaboration between the advancement department, which includes those people that are trying to get new members to the Sierra Club, and the communications department and the digital strategies department. And the three departments working together have a program called Connect. It doesn't really stand for anything, but it's basically trying to connect all the different departments and all the different people that are entering the Sierra Club, and then trying to get them to move up through the ladder of engagement and ultimately become members and become leaders. And we are looking at a number of ways of doing this. One is we looked at the potential of how many people come to the website and then leave, and you never hear from them again. And so one of the ideas of the website redesign is to basically make it easier, more friendly, more inclusive, and more sticky, so that people want to stay and search around a little bit more to find out the right thing to do. Next thing is when you have some kind of online petition through AdUp or any kind of other electronic outreach that we have, how do you make sure that when that person responds and does the easiest thing possible, that is be a clicktivist, basically say, oh yes, send my petition to my member of Congress, now I'm opting out and that's the end of it. But instead having a feedback mechanism that basically says, that's wonderful, here's what just happened, you know, on the issue that you showed us you cared about because you did a click, and here's another issue also in your neighborhood, also right up the same kind of alley of concerns, and maybe you ought to take a look at this one too because it might be exciting to you. And you know, here's a little local meeting that's happening on that. So it doesn't rely strictly on, you know, you've got to go to the monthly chapter meeting face to face, but you can basically start creating some online engagement opportunities to build online community that hopefully will eventually migrate into a more meaningful on-land community. And so that's what Connect is designed to do. Now it has a conservation component, which is very important for both chapter directors and national program department staff, because if you don't have good content there and you can't constantly give people the feedback and tell them what's the next thing, you know, then you aren't going to sink the hook and land the fish. So, you know, there's more to be done. It's not just a matter of digital strategies and communications and advancement, but if it doesn't have the substance that is in there that is compelling and constantly updated so that people are being recognized and treated as valuable individuals and participants, that's what's ultimately going to get them to stay. And then eventually you say, hey, why don't you actually join? This is a very welcoming and fun and impactful organization. And then why don't you come to a meeting? And then why don't you run for office? But it'll take some time to get there. But yes, the online place is the biggest potential that is out there. You know, the other things we'll keep doing direct mail and stuff, but it's basically treading water, and that's not where the real chance to broaden the Sierra Club and invite in lots more youth, lots more people of color, lots more Spanish speaking. So there's a lot of outreach specifically designed to those new communities that are the directions that we want to build the Sierra Club. And so we have special people on staff that are dedicated just to outreach to Spanish-speaking community, for example, and they're trying to figure out how to put out op-eds, buy lists, but not buy lists to then join the Sierra Club and suddenly get this white organization, but to get in a channel that speaks to them, speaks to their issues, speaks to the kinds of outings that they feel comfortable participating in, and ultimately recognizing that the Sierra Club's a home for them.
Okay, great.
Anybody else have questions or thoughts to share with Bruce?
So Scott, I don't know if you told them, but I did put up some history resources. Did you send it out to everybody, or?
No, but what I'm going to do, Bruce, is add that on to our ongoing spreadsheet of these webinars so that folks will be able to refer to those for further information and resources. So thanks for sharing.
Yeah, so it's the notes from the talk I gave today. There's a speech that I gave to the Commonwealth Club on 125 years of history and the mistakes we made and the lessons we learned in that. There's a wonderful piece that Rebecca Solnit did on the dark history and bright history of the Sierra Club that was for our 125th anniversary, and then some books that are just the straight glossed over history that are useful if you just want to go look up, when did we help save this park or that wilderness area or pass the Endangered Species Act, but they aren't really digging deep to look at the backstory.
So any final questions or thoughts before we wrap up today, folks?
Hey, I just wanted to say, I think last year the Sierra Club had a celebration at Cedar Key in Florida, where John Muir spent his last moments before he took off for various places, I guess New York and Cuba, before coming to San Francisco.
Yeah.
And it was huge. They worship him over there on that little island that, by the way, is going to be gone because of climate change. But he is like a big deal over there. And they had this big event, and there were like 100 people showed up at this lecture, and they went to the tree where he recovered this oak tree and all this stuff. And it's just really fascinating. The last moments in Florida before, this disease, this malaria that he contracted, not in Florida, but in a Savannah cemetery.
Mm-hmm.
And then led him to come to California. So there's a lot of stuff going on in the East Coast as well as the West Coast regards to Muir.
Yep. So if you come across questions where people are suddenly, raising issues about, Sierra Club founders or John Muir's derogatory statements about Native Americans or things like that, I won't gloss over it. I'll share you all the information so you've got the full perspective and you can figure out for yourself how you feel about it and then how best to talk about it with others. There's a good piece by Hop Hopkins he put out within the last week on this matter too, and the whole history of immigration.
Anything else? I want to thank you all for showing up. Again, this will pop up shortly in terms of a link to this video and the slideshow and the other information that Bruce presented. I do want to flag that 2 weeks from today is Thanksgiving Day, so we will not be conducting a webinar then. Instead, our next webinar will take place on December 6th, and the topic will be the Equity Department. So we'll have Brittany Harris, the Equity Training Coordinator, presenting 4 weeks from today. And I want to thank you all for being here, and a particular thanks to you, Bruce, for taking your time and presenting such a good set of information for folks, giving context about the club.
Okay, glad to meet you all, and pick up the phone anytime you need help.
Goodbye, all.
Or want to chew me out. Okay.
Thank you,
Take
Bruce.
care.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.